I'm Commander Lauren Ellis, 42, and I built my career from a small Gulf Coast garage all the way to Navy Special Warfare. For years, I put my reputation and my time on the line to support someone I trusted like family. But when he publicly threw me under the bus to save himself, everything shifted. Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, or betrayed by someone you carried for years? If you have, share your story in the comments. Trust me, you're not the only one. Before I walk you through what happened, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to reclaim your dignity after someone crossed a line, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, power, and standing up for yourself. What followed might surprise you. I grew up in a Gulf Coast town where trucks weren't status symbols, they were survival. My father ran a small repair shop out of a converted barn, and by the time I was 12, I could diagnose a failing alternator by sound alone. While other girls were learning contouring techniques, I was learning torque specifications. My mother died when I was 8, and my father raised me the only way he knew how, with discipline, consistency, and the expectation that I'd solve my own problems before asking for help. I played varsity soccer and ran track, not because I loved sports particularly, but because I needed the structure. I worked weekends at a marine supply store, saving money in a college fund my father insisted I maintain. I wasn't exceptional in any single area, but I was reliable. That mattered more than talent in the world I came from. When I decided to join the Navy, my father simply nodded. He'd served 20 years himself, though he never talked about it much. He drove me to the recruiter's office, shook my hand at the door, and said, "Don't embarrass yourself." That was his version of encouragement, and I understood it perfectly. Officer Candidate School was exactly what I expected, structured chaos designed to identify who could function under pressure. I commissioned as an ensign at 23, nothing remarkable about the ceremony except that my father showed up in a suit I'd never seen him wear. Afterward, he said, "You'll do fine," and drove home the same day. My first operational rotation introduced me to Lieutenant Mason Rourke. He was 24, newly minted, and assigned to the same support unit. Mason had the kind of easy charm that worked well in briefings, but less well in execution. He was competent enough, but he cut corners when he thought no one was watching. The problem was, someone was always watching. I first covered for him 6 months into our assignment. He'd missed a critical deadline for a logistics report, the kind of thing that could derail an entire training evolution. I stayed up until 0300 hours, reconstructed the data, and submitted it under joint authorship. When our commanding officer praised the thoroughness, Mason accepted the compliment without mentioning my involvement. I didn't correct him. At the time, I told myself it was about mission success, not credit. That established a pattern. Mason would overcommit and underdeliver, and I would quietly fill the gaps. When he struggled with navigation briefs, I walked him through the procedures until he could execute them independently. When he made a tactically questionable call during an exercise that could have resulted in a formal counseling, I reframed the situation in my report to emphasize learning rather than failure. We both advanced to lieutenant junior grade on schedule. By the time I made full lieutenant at 28, Mason was right behind me, promoted a year later. The difference was that I'd earned my evaluations through consistent performance. Mason had earned his through association with competent people who protected his reputation. I was selected for advanced training with Special Operations Support Units when I was 30. The pipeline wasn't the dramatic hell some people imagine, but it was unforgiving of weakness. You either met the standard or you didn't, and the standard didn't adjust for anyone. I met it. Mason applied the following year and didn't make the cut. He told people it was a scheduling conflict. I never corrected that story either. By my mid-30s, I'd made lieutenant commander and was running operational logistics for a specialized detachment. Mason had progressed to full lieutenant, capable but increasingly comfortable with being capable enough. When his marriage fell apart, I helped him find temporary housing near the base. When he faced administrative questions about a training incident that wasn't entirely his fault, I provided detailed testimony that cleared him. When he needed advice on his evaluation metrics, I spent hours reviewing his performance record and highlighting areas he could emphasize. I didn't think of it as charity. I thought of it as what you did for your people. Mason wasn't officially my subordinate for most of that time, but he was part of my professional circle, and I believed in taking care of that circle. At 36, I was promoted to commander. Mason made lieutenant commander 2 years later, at 38. By then, I'd accumulated nearly 15 years of operational experience, multiple commendations, and a reputation for getting things done without drama. Mason had accumulated a solid record of competence, largely built on the foundation of people who'd covered his gaps. When I took command of a joint special operations detachment, Mason requested assignment to my team. I approved it. He was familiar, reliable in his way, and I believed I knew how to manage his weaknesses. That was my first significant miscalculation. The imbalance between us had been growing for years, but I'd been too focused on the mission to notice. I'd invested hundreds of hours in his career, training time, administrative coverage, professional advocacy. I'd written letters of recommendation, made calls to detailers, and quietly cleaned up his mistakes so they wouldn't follow him. Mason had invested nothing comparable in mine. When I needed assistance with a complex planning cycle, he was unavailable. When I asked for his input on a personnel matter, he delegated it back to me. When I suggested cross-training opportunities that would benefit the team, he dismissed them as unnecessary. I didn't resent the imbalance initially. I was senior, it was my job to mentor. But mentorship implies growth, and Mason had stopped growing years ago. He'd simply learned how to position himself near people who would compensate for his limitations. I remember sitting in my office late one night, reviewing 10 years of email correspondence. Subject lines that told the whole story. Quick question about the ops order, need your advice. Can you look this over before I submit it? Hundreds of requests, almost none reciprocated. I wasn't angry exactly, just tired. My senior enlisted advisor, Master Chief Adrian Cole, had been watching the dynamic longer than I had. He was 45, a veteran of more deployments than I could count, and he had no patience for professional imbalance. One afternoon, after Mason had left my office following another request for help with a task he should have been able to handle independently, the Master Chief closed the door and sat down without being invited. "Ma'am, you know he's using you." I looked up from my screen. "He's a member of the team. He's a liability you keep insulating from consequences." The Master Chief's voice was even factual. "And he knows it." I didn't argue. I didn't agree either. But I also didn't forget the observation. I thought loyalty worked both ways. At the time, I still believed that. Mason arrived at my command with a new variable in his life, Brianna Hale. She was 28, worked in marketing for a defense contractor, and maintained an aggressively curated social media presence. Everything was content. Every meal, every trip, every moment was framed for maximum visibility. I met her once at a unit function. She was pleasant enough, though she spent more time photographing the venue than engaging with anyone present. Mason seemed different around her, more performative. He laughed louder, talked more, and referenced things that had nothing to do with our work. That was fine. People are entitled to their personal lives. What wasn't fine was when his personal life started rewriting his professional history. It started small. In a planning meeting, Mason casually mentioned that he'd figured out a navigation solution on a previous deployment. I'd walked him through that exact solution over the course of 3 days. He didn't acknowledge that. He presented it as independent problem-solving. Another time, during a briefing with the detachment leadership, he described handling a complex logistics challenge on his own. I'd personally coordinated half the vendors and reviewed every contract. When I gently corrected the record, he smiled and said, "Well, it was a team effort." That phrase, team effort, became his default deflection whenever his retelling didn't match reality. The interruptions started around the same time. In meetings, I'd be mid-sentence when Mason would interject with, "What the commander means is," or "Let me clarify that." It was subtle enough that calling it out would seem petty, but it happened consistently enough that others noticed. Junior officers started glancing at me when he did it, waiting to see if I'd respond. I usually didn't. I was trying to model professionalism, not dominance. His language shifted, too. Phrases like, "You don't need to micromanage," or "We've got this handled, ma'am," became common. They were framed as reassurance, but the subtext was clear. I was being positioned as overbearing, overly involved. The fact that my involvement was usually the reason things succeeded was conveniently omitted. Mason began declining difficult assignments. When a sensitive operation required detailed coordination, he suddenly had scheduling conflicts. When a VIP visit demanded precision, he volunteered for lower visibility tasks. But when there was a photo opportunity or a chance to brief senior leadership, Mason was available. He understood optics better than operations. The most telling incident happened during a unit memorial ceremony. One of our community's senior leaders had died in a training accident, and we gathered to honor his service. It was important. Not optional, not negotiable, important. Mason didn't show. I called him afterward. Where were you? I had a thing with Brianna's family. It was planned weeks ago. This was on the calendar for a month, Mason. Yeah, I know. But, relationships require compromise. I didn't respond immediately. When I did, my voice was flat. That wasn't about compromise. That was about priorities. Come on, Commander. It's not like he knew I wasn't there. I ended the call without another word. Master Chief Cole found me in my office an hour later. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just said, "You can't fix people who don't think they're broken, ma'am." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice right then. Over the following weeks, Mason's dismissiveness became standard. He stopped asking for my input, then stopped acknowledging it when I provided it anyway. Reports I'd asked him to prepare arrived late and incomplete. When I returned them for correction, he acted as though I was being unreasonable. I overheard him talking to a junior officer once, someone new to the team. "The commander's very detail-oriented," Mason said, with a tone that made it sound like a criticism. "Sometimes you just have to let things go, The junior officer looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. I didn't confront Mason about that conversation. I was still trying to manage the situation professionally, still hoping he'd recognize the imbalance and correct it himself. That hope was becoming harder to maintain. The breaking point wasn't one of his absences or dismissals. It was something quieter and more corrosive. During a team training evolution, Mason made a significant procedural error that could have compromised the exercise. I corrected it in real time, as any commander would. Afterward, I pulled him aside privately to review what had gone wrong. "I had it under control," he said. "You didn't. That's why I intervened. Not everyone needs constant oversight. Mason, this isn't about oversight. This is about maintaining standards." He looked at me with something I'd never seen from him before, contempt. Not frustration, not defensiveness, contempt. "Maybe the problem isn't my performance," he said. "Maybe it's your expectations." He walked away before I could respond. That night, I sat in my quarters and reviewed every evaluation I'd written for him, every recommendation I'd provided, every time I'd repositioned his mistakes as learning opportunities. I'd given him years. I'd given him credibility. I'd given him benefit of the doubt he had never earned. And in return, he'd given me excuses, deflection, and a growing reputation as someone who was too rigid, too demanding, too involved. The person I'd once protected was now someone I needed to protect the unit from. The briefing was scheduled for 0900 hours on a Tuesday. A visiting Rear Admiral was reviewing our operational readiness, and every element of the presentation needed to be airtight. I'd assigned Mason responsibility for the logistics section 3 weeks prior. It was straightforward: personnel numbers, equipment status, supply chain timelines. He'd done similar briefs a dozen times. The night before, I asked him if he was prepared. "Absolutely. I've got it covered." I didn't review his slides. That was my second miscalculation. The Admiral arrived on time, accompanied by his aide and 2 members of his staff. We gathered in the conference room, and I opened with the operational overview. My section went smoothly: clear data, concise delivery, no questions. I transitioned to Mason. His first 3 slides were fine. Then he reached the equipment readiness chart, and I saw the problem immediately. The data was incomplete. Maintenance schedules were missing. Projected timelines didn't account for ongoing repairs. It wasn't just rough, it was wrong. The Admiral leaned forward. "Commander Rourke, these numbers don't align with the report I reviewed last month." Where's the updated maintenance log? Mason hesitated. Just for a second, but long enough that everyone noticed. Then he said, Commander Ellis was supposed to provide those figures. The room went silent. It was a lie, and everyone in that room knew it. The logistics section was his responsibility. The tasking email was in writing. But he just deflected blame onto me in front of a flag officer. I didn't react visibly. I opened my tablet, pulled up the correct data, and addressed the Admiral directly. Sir, the updated maintenance log is here. I'll have the complete readiness report on your desk within 2 hours. The Admiral nodded, his expression unreadable. See that you do. The briefing continued, but the damage was done. Mason didn't apologize, didn't correct himself, didn't even look uncomfortable. He simply moved to the next slide as though nothing had happened. Afterward, the Admiral's aide approached me privately. For what it's worth, ma'am, we know whose responsibility that was. It was professional courtesy, nothing more. But the fact that he felt the need to say it meant the incident would be remembered. I found Mason in the hallway 20 minutes later. My office. Now. He followed, but his posture was casual, unconcerned. I closed the door and stood behind my desk. I didn't sit. I didn't invite him to sit, either. That was unacceptable. He shrugged. It was a briefing. Things happen. You lied, Mason. In front of a flag officer. You publicly blamed me for your failure. I didn't lie. I just misspoke. No. You lied. And you know it. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Look, it's just politics. You know how these things work. Don't take it personally. This isn't personal. This is professional. And what you did was unprofessional. Maybe, he said, his tone shifting to something sharper, you need to accept that not everything is about control. Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes you need to let things go. I kept my voice level. I've let things go for years, Mason. I've covered for you, advocated for you, protected your reputation when you didn't deserve it. Today, you repaid that by throwing me under the bus to save yourself embarrassment. You're being dramatic. I'm being accurate. He pushed off the wall, suddenly irritated. You know what your problem is? You're too sensitive for command. You take everything personally. This is a high-pressure environment, and if you can't handle a little deflection, maybe you're not cut out for it. I didn't respond immediately. I just looked at him, this person I'd mentored, supported, and defended for over a decade. And I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. Maybe I never had. Get out of my office. He left without another word. The rumors started within 48 hours. Whispers that I'd been unprepared for the Admiral's visit. Suggestions that I was rigid, inflexible, unwilling to share responsibility. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than perception, and Mason had successfully planted doubt. Junior officers started approaching me with cautious questions. Ma'am, is everything okay with the command? They didn't ask directly, but the concern was clear. My reputation, built over 2 decades of consistent performance, was suddenly in question because of one man's deflection. Master Chief Cole didn't mince words. He's using your credibility as a safety net, ma'am. He knows you won't let the ship sink, so he pushes boundaries because there's no real consequence. There will be now. The Master Chief nodded. Good. I spent that evening documenting everything. I pulled every email, every tasking order, every evaluation I'd written for Mason over the years. I reviewed timelines, cross-referenced performance reports, and built a factual record of his pattern of behavior. Not out of anger, out of necessity. I scheduled a meeting with my immediate superior, a captain who'd known both of us for years. I presented the documentation without editorial. Just facts, assigned tasks, completed tasks, instances of deflection, patterns of underperformance. The captain reviewed the file in silence. Then he looked up. This is thorough. Yes, sir. You're requesting his reassignment. I am. He's going to push back. I'm aware. The captain closed the folder. I'll support this. But be prepared for fallout. He's not going to go quietly. I know. I left that meeting with clarity I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. The transfer request went through official channels within 72 hours. Mason was to be reassigned to a staff billet at a different command, effective in 30 days. It was professional, procedural, and entirely justified by documented performance issues. There was no drama in the paperwork, no personal accusations, just a clear record that his presence was detrimental to unit cohesion. Mason found out through official notification. He didn't come to me first. He went directly to the command leadership and requested a meeting to contest the decision. That meeting lasted 15 minutes. The captain listened, reviewed the documentation I'd provided, and denied the appeal. The transfer stood. That's when Mason came to my office. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and walked in, his face flushed. "You're ruining my career." I looked up from my computer. "Close the door." He kicked it shut. "You can't do this. It's already done." Over one briefing? Over one mistake? I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice even. This isn't about one briefing. This is about a pattern of behavior spanning years. Behavior I documented thoroughly before making this request. You're exaggerating. I'm being factual. You've been underperforming for years, Mason. I've been covering for it. That ends now. He stepped closer to my desk. You owe me. After everything I stop. I stood, not aggressive, just present. I owe you nothing. If anything, you owe me years of integrity you never provided. I made one comment in one briefing. You lied to a flag officer and blamed me publicly. That wasn't a mistake, Mason. That was a choice. He stared at me, his anger shifting into something closer to panic. If you do this, my career is over. Your career isn't over. You're being reassigned to a staff position where your performance will be visible and measurable. If you succeed, you'll advance. If you don't, that's on you. You're ending my career over nothing. I shook my head. I'm ending my tolerance for your behavior. There's a difference. He turned toward the door, then stopped. You think you're untouchable because you're good at paperwork. You think rank protects you. But people see what you really are. And what's that? A control freak who can't let anyone succeed without her permission. I didn't react. I just waited until he left, the door slamming behind him. The text started that night. Long messages about betrayal, about loyalty, about how I didn't understand what I was doing to him. I didn't respond. By the third day, he'd sent 14 messages. I forwarded them to the command legal office for documentation and blocked his number. He tried a different approach. He started appearing in places he knew I'd be: the gym, the commissary, the parking lot near my building. Never overtly threatening, just present. Master Chief Cole noticed and assigned an escort protocol without me asking. You don't need the distraction, ma'am. Brianna's social media activity shifted during this period. Vague posts about toxic leadership and women who tear other women down. Nothing explicit, nothing I could address formally, but the implication was clear. A few junior personnel mentioned seeing the posts. I told them to ignore it. Professionalism meant not engaging with noise. A week before Mason's transfer date, a senior officer from a different command called me. He was someone I respected, someone whose judgment I valued. Lauren, I heard about the situation with Lieutenant Commander Rourke. Yes, sir. He's been reaching out to people, trying to build a case that this is personal rather than professional. It's not personal. It's documented. I know. I reviewed the file. But I wanted to ask, is there any way to smooth this over? For unit cohesion. I took a breath. Sir, with respect, cohesion requires accountability, not indulgence. Lieutenant Commander Rourke has demonstrated that he cannot function effectively in this command. Moving him is the right call. There was a pause. Then understood. I'll support your decision. Thank you, sir. Mason's final day in the command was quiet. He cleared his workspace, turned in his equipment, and left without speaking to most of the team. As he walked out, he passed me in the hallway. He stopped. You think you won? His voice was low, controlled. Watch what happens next. I met his eyes. I'm not watching you anymore, Mason. I'm done. He left. Master Chief Cole found me an hour later. How are you holding up, ma'am? I'm fine. You did the right thing. I know. He nodded and left me alone in my office. I looked at the stack of personnel files on my desk, the operational plans awaiting review, the normal work of command. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The decision stood. The documentation was filed. The unit moved forward. And I moved forward with it. Mason's new assignment was a staff position at a Joint Task Force headquarters. It was a visible billet, one where performance couldn't be hidden behind other people's competence. Reports had deadlines. Briefings had audiences. Mistakes had consequences. Within 2 months, I started hearing things through the informal network that connects military communities. Mason was struggling. He'd missed multiple deadlines. His briefings were disorganized. His supervisors were less accommodating than I'd been, less willing to compensate for his gaps. I didn't take satisfaction in that information. I just noted it and moved on. His success or failure was no longer my responsibility. 3 months into his assignment, Brianna's social media went dark for a week. When it came back online, the posts about Mason had stopped. There were new photos, different locations, different people, vague captions about moving forward and new chapters. Someone mentioned seeing her with someone else at a local restaurant. Mason's promotion to commander came up for review at the 6-month mark. According to someone who'd seen the board results, his package was deferred. Not rejected outright, but set aside for reconsideration pending improved performance. It was the kind of outcome that happens when your record shows potential, but your recent evaluations show decline. I didn't monitor his career actively. Information just filtered through the network the way it always does. People talk. I listened when it was relevant and ignored it when it wasn't. My own detachment, meanwhile, flourished. With Mason gone, the operational tempo stabilized. Junior officers stepped up without the confusion of conflicting guidance. Evaluations came back exemplary. The command climate survey reflected improved morale and cohesion. We executed 2 major exercises without significant issues and received commendations for both. 6 months after Mason's transfer, I was called into the captain's office. He handed me a folder without preamble. "You're being recommended for a Joint Task Force assignment. Competitive billet. They specifically requested you." I opened the folder and scanned the details. It was a significant opportunity, the kind that marked you as someone being considered for higher leadership. "Thank you, sir. You earned it. Your performance over the last year has been exceptional." I didn't mention that the last year's performance was partly the result of removing someone who'd been undermining it. I just accepted the recognition and moved forward. I started seeing what life looked like without carrying someone else's weight. My schedule had space in it. I slept better. I stopped second-guessing decisions because I wasn't constantly compensating for someone else's gaps. The work was still demanding, but it was clean demanding, the kind that comes from legitimate challenges, not interpersonal dysfunction. Master Chief Cole noticed. "You seem lighter, ma'am." "I feel lighter." "Good. That's how it should be." I ran into Mason once during this period, at a regional training conference. We were in the same building, but different sessions. I saw him across the lobby, looking tired and older than I remembered. He saw me too. He didn't approach. He just nodded slightly and kept walking. I returned the gesture and continued to my session. That was the entirety of our interaction. No confrontation, no drama. Just 2 people whose professional paths had diverged, acknowledging each other's existence and moving on. I thought about that moment later. About how much energy I'd invested in him over the years. About how little of it had mattered in the end. About how the best thing I'd ever done for my own career was stop trying to save his. Master Chief Cole had been right months ago. You can't fix people who don't think they're broken. And you can't carry people who won't carry themselves. The only choice is whether you let their weight drag you down or whether you set it aside and keep moving. I'd chosen to keep moving. During a planning meeting around this time, a junior lieutenant asked me for advice on handling a difficult subordinate. I listened to the situation, recognized some familiar patterns, and gave him the guidance I wished someone had given me years earlier. Document everything. Set clear expectations. Give them opportunity to improve. But if they won't, don't sacrifice the unit trying to save one person. Your responsibility is to the mission and the team, not to protecting someone from consequences they've earned. He nodded, taking notes. "Did you learn that from experience, ma'am?" "Yes," I said. "Expensive experience." Later that week, I received a message from my detailer about the Joint Task Force position. The assignment was confirmed. I'd transfer in 90 days. It was a significant step forward, exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward for years. I looked at the notification, then looked around my office. At the plaques on the wall, the unit photos, the operational maps. At the evidence of work done well, of problems solved, of people led effectively. All of it had been possible because I'd finally made the hard decision to prioritize the mission over misplaced loyalty. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply the removal of what held you back. Mason requested a meeting 4 months after his transfer. The email was brief and professional. Would you have time to talk? I'll keep it short. I considered not responding. The chapter was closed. Reopening it served no purpose. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what he thought there was left to say. 15 minutes. My office. Thursday at 1400 hours. He arrived exactly on time. He looked different, thinner, more worn. He stood in the doorway until I gestured to the chair. He sat carefully, as though aware of being in someone else's space. Thank you for seeing me. I didn't respond. I just waited. He took a breath. I handled things poorly. The briefing, the transfer, all of it. You didn't deserve what I said or how I acted. I kept my expression neutral. Go on. I spent a lot of years taking things for granted. Your help, your patience, your willingness to cover for me. I didn't appreciate it. I didn't even recognize it half the time. And when you finally stopped, I blamed you instead of looking at myself. I still didn't speak. I wanted to see how much of this was genuine and how much was strategic. The last few months have been difficult. I've been struggling in this new position. No one there is interested in making things easier for me. They just expect me to perform. And when I don't, there are consequences. That's called accountability, I said quietly. I know. He looked down at his hands. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. You invested a lot in me over the years, and I repaid that by undermining you. That was wrong. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. The apology seemed genuine, but I'd seen Mason be convincing before. Still, there was something different now, something that felt less like performance and more like exhaustion. I accept the apology, I said finally. But we're not returning to how things were. I understand. I mean it, Mason. This isn't a reconciliation. This is me acknowledging that you've recognized a problem. What you do with that recognition is your responsibility, not mine. I know. I stood, signaling the meeting was over. He stood as well, hesitating at the door. For what it's worth, he said, you're a better officer than I ever gave you credit for. That's not worth much now, I replied. But it's noted. He left. Master Chief Cole appeared in my doorway 10 minutes later. How'd it go? He apologized. You believe him? I believe he's struggling. Whether he changes or not isn't my concern anymore. Good answer, ma'am. Over the following weeks, I maintained strict professional boundaries with Mason. When he sent a follow-up email asking for advice on a personnel issue, I responded with a brief, factual answer and nothing more. When he asked if I'd be willing to provide feedback on his evaluation, I declined politely but firmly. I'm not the right person for that, Mason. You need to build relationships within your current command. He didn't argue. He just accepted it and moved on. A month later, I heard he'd improved slightly in his new position. He was meeting deadlines more consistently, showing up prepared for meetings. It wasn't exceptional performance, but it was adequate. That was enough for now. I also heard he'd requested a transfer to a different type of assignment, something more technical and less leadership-focused. It was a smart move, playing to his actual strengths rather than the role he thought he wanted. If he followed through with that, he might stabilize his career. But none of that was my problem anymore. I focused on my own transition. The Joint Task Force position required relocation and a complete shift in operational focus. I spent my final weeks at the detachment ensuring smooth handover, mentoring my replacement, and closing out administrative requirements. On my last day, the team held a brief ceremony. Nothing elaborate, just a formation, some words from the captain, a plaque. Master Chief Cole shook my hand and said, "It's been an honor, ma'am." "Likewise, Master Chief." As I packed my office, I found an old photo from years earlier, the unit during a training exercise. Mason was in it, standing in the second row, young and eager. I looked at that photo for a long moment, then filed it away in a box marked archive. The relationship we'd had was over. What remained was professional distance, clear boundaries, and the understanding that his redemption, if it happened at all, was something he'd have to earn on his own. I wasn't responsible for saving him. I never had been. A year into the Joint Task Force assignment, my life had settled into a new rhythm. The work was demanding but clean, complex problems, competent people, and a command structure that valued performance over politics. I'd been promoted to commander 3 years earlier, and the evaluation reports suggested I was on track for consideration to captain in the next cycle. I was 42, physically fit, professionally respected, and genuinely content with where my career had landed. The Mason situation felt distant now, like something that had happened to a different version of myself. One Saturday afternoon, I realized my aging pickup truck, inherited from my father 7 years earlier, was finally done. The mechanic had delivered the news kindly. "Ma'am, you could keep pouring money into this, but you'd be better off putting it towards something new." So I drove to a dealership on the edge of town, wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, my hair pulled back. I looked like exactly what I was on a Saturday afternoon, someone running errands. The lot was busy. Families browsing SUVs, couples comparing sedans. I walked past all of them toward the truck section in the back. Heavy-duty models, the kind built for actual work, not suburban aesthetics. A salesman spotted me from across the lot. He was maybe 55, wearing a polo shirt with the dealership logo, and he had that particular smile salespeople develop, friendly until they decide you're not worth the effort. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking at the heavy-duty trucks." I gestured toward a model at the end of the row. "I'd like to test drive that one." He glanced at the truck, then back at me. His smile shifted slightly, becoming more patronizing. "That's a big truck." "Are you sure?" "It's got a lot of power, might be more than you're used to handling." "I'm sure." He laughed, not meanly, but dismissively. "That truck is really for men, honey. It's a serious work vehicle. Let me show you something more practical." I didn't react visibly. I just waited. He walked toward the SUV section. "Now, we've got some great family vehicles over here. Excellent safety ratings, plenty of space for groceries, easy to park. I don't need a family vehicle. I need a truck." "Right, but what are you actually going to use it for?" His tone was patient, the way you'd explain something to a child. "Most women prefer something easier to manage. Trust me, I've been doing this for 20 years. That truck back there? It's not what you want." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. I extracted my military ID and handed it to him without a word. He glanced at it casually, still talking. "Like I said, I can get you into something that..." He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had found the relevant line on the ID. Rank, Commander 05. Designation, Naval Special Warfare / Joint Special Operations. He looked up at me, then back down at the ID. The keys to the truck he dismissed were in his other hand. He seemed to forget he was holding them. He cleared his throat. "I didn't realize." I took the ID back calmly. "The truck. I'd like to test drive it." He handed me the keys without another word. His hand was shaking slightly. I walked back to the heavy-duty truck, unlocked it, adjusted the seat and mirrors, and started the engine. It ran smoothly, good torque, solid transmission response. I took it out onto the highway, ran it through various conditions, and confirmed it met my requirements. When I returned to the lot 20 minutes later, the salesman was standing exactly where I'd left him. Another salesperson had joined him, a manager, based on his name tag. The manager stepped forward. "Ma'am, I apologize for any confusion. We'd be honored to help you with your purchase today." "No confusion," I said evenly. "Just assumptions." I bought the truck. The financing took 45 minutes, and during that entire time, the original salesman avoided looking directly at me. When I signed the final papers, the manager offered his hand. "Thank you for your service." I shook it briefly. "Just doing my job." I drove off the lot in the truck, the late afternoon sun reflecting off the hood. The vehicle handled exactly as I'd expected, powerful, reliable, built for purpose rather than appearance. I thought about the salesman's face when he'd read my ID. About the assumption that because I was a woman, I couldn't handle something built for serious work. About how quickly people adjust their behavior when their assumptions are proven wrong. I'd spent 20 years proving assumptions wrong. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. The salesman was simply the latest in a long line of people who'd underestimated me based on appearance rather than capability. As I drove home, I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. The years in service, the difficult decisions, the professional battles, the choice to stop carrying people who wouldn't carry themselves. Mason's betrayal and the fallout that followed. The slow rebuilding of trust and reputation. The promotions, the evaluations, the quiet accumulation of competence and respect. People underestimate you. They always will. Some do it because of your gender, some because of your demeanor, some because you don't perform confidence the way they expect. It doesn't matter why. What matters is what you do with that underestimation. You can exhaust yourself trying to correct every assumption, or you can simply perform and let results speak. You can demand recognition, or you can build a record so solid that recognition becomes inevitable. I'd chosen the latter. Not out of patience or nobility, out of pragmatism. Energy spent defending yourself is energy not spent on the mission. And the mission always mattered more than the comfort of people who couldn't see past their own limitations. The truck handled the highway well. I'd need it for the occasional move between duty stations, for transporting equipment, for the practical demands of military life that civilians rarely consider. It would serve its purpose reliably, without fanfare, without needing to justify its existence. I respected that. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting over the water. I sat in the truck for a moment, engine idling, watching the light change. Somewhere out there, Mason was still working to rebuild a career he nearly destroyed through his own carelessness. Brianna was posting about her new life with someone else. The salesman was probably telling his colleagues about the woman commander he'd underestimated. The admiral whose briefing had gone sideways months ago had long since moved on to other concerns. All of it, the betrayal, the consequences, the assumptions, the corrections, was just part of the landscape of a life spent in service. Not exceptional. Not unique. Just the accumulated experience of someone who'd chosen a difficult path and stayed on it when easier options existed. I turned off the engine, grabbed my keys, and went inside. The truck sat in the driveway, solid and unremarkable. Exactly what I'd needed. Nothing more, nothing less. And that, I thought, was enough. 25 years is a long time in any life. In a military career, it's almost incomprehensible, the span between who you are as a young officer and who you become by the end. I'm 67 now, long retired, and the person I was at 42 feels like someone I knew well but no longer inhabit. I retired as a Rear Admiral at 56, after 33 years of service. The progression from commander to captain took 4 years, standard timing for someone with a solid record. Captain to Rear Admiral took another 7, which was faster than standard and reflected assignments I'd earned through performance rather than politics. I commanded a carrier strike group, served on a joint task force coordinating multinational operations, and spent my final tour at the Pentagon in a strategic planning role that I found intellectually satisfying but politically exhausting. I never married. That wasn't a sacrifice or a regret, just a fact. I had relationships over the years, some serious, most not. I had close friendships, professional partnerships that felt like family, and a sense of purpose that filled the spaces other people filled with spouses and children. My father died when I was 51, quietly in his sleep, in the same house where I'd grown up. I inherited that house and kept it, though I rarely visited. It sits there still, a physical anchor to a version of myself that feels both familiar and foreign. The Mason situation became a footnote in my career, something that happened, that I managed, that I moved past. I didn't think about it often. When I did, it was with the detached clarity that comes from distance. He'd been a lesson in recognizing when loyalty becomes enabling, and I'd learned it thoroughly enough that I never repeated the mistake. I heard about Mason periodically over the years through the informal network that never quite dissolves, even in retirement. He stabilized after our final conversation, found his level as a staff officer, and retired as a lieutenant commander at 20 years. Respectable enough. Not exceptional, but respectable. He'd married someone else after Brianna, I never learned her name, and moved to Colorado. That was the last I heard. I didn't keep track deliberately. Information just filtered through occasionally, the way it does when you've spent decades in a relatively small community. My retirement was structured the way I'd structured everything else, carefully, methodically, with clear objectives. I bought a small house on the Gulf Coast, not far from where I'd grown up, but far enough to feel like neutral territory. I consulted occasionally for defense contractors on logistics and operational planning, enough to stay intellectually engaged, not enough to feel like work. I ran every morning, maintained a disciplined routine, and discovered that I genuinely enjoyed solitude in a way I'd never had time to explore during my career. I also discovered that aging changes things. Not dramatically at first, but incrementally. A knee that started bothering me in my late 50s, managed with physical therapy and occasional cortisone injections. Vision that required progressive lenses by 60. The slow realization that I couldn't maintain the same physical standards I'd held myself to for decades, and the harder realization that I needed to accept that rather than fight it. By 67, I'd made peace with those limitations. I still ran, but shorter distances at a slower pace. I still maintained discipline, but with more flexibility. I'd learned, finally, belatedly, that self-respect didn't require perfection. It just required consistency and honest self-assessment. I didn't expect to see Mason again. Our paths had diverged completely, our lives moving in separate trajectories that had no reason to intersect. I'd been retired for 11 years. He'd been retired for longer. We existed in different worlds now, connected only by a shared past that mattered less with each passing year. Then I received an invitation to a reunion. It arrived by email, forwarded through a veterans organization I joined mostly for the networking opportunities. A gathering of personnel who'd served in naval special warfare during a particular operational period, roughly the decade when Mason and I had overlapped. The event was scheduled for October at a conference center in Virginia Beach. Optional attendance, casual dress, a chance to reconnect with people who'd shared a particular chapter of military history. I almost didn't go. I'd attended similar events before and found them unsatisfying. Too much nostalgia, too many people trying to relive glory that felt less glorious in retrospect. But something about this invitation made me reconsider. Maybe it was the specific time frame. Maybe it was curiosity about who else would attend. Maybe it was just the fact that I had nothing else scheduled that weekend. I RSVP'd affirmatively and made arrangements. The drive to Virginia Beach took 6 hours. I left early on a Friday morning, the highway familiar from decades of similar trips. The conference center was modern and generic, the kind of space that could host anything from a corporate retreat to a wedding reception. I arrived mid-afternoon, checked into the adjacent hotel, and spent an hour reviewing the attendee list that had been posted online. There were 83 names. I recognized maybe 40. Some were people I'd worked with closely. Others were familiar only as names from reports or brief encounters. Mason's name was on the list. I noted it without emotion and continued reviewing. The event began at 1800 hours with a reception in the main conference hall. I dressed in business casual, slacks, a collared shirt, comfortable shoes. I wore my Naval Academy ring and a small pin indicating my rank at retirement, not out of ego, but out of practicality. People would want to know, and the visual shorthand saved repetitive conversations. The hall was already crowded when I arrived. Groups clustered around high-top tables, conversations animated with the particular energy of people reconnecting after years apart. I recognized faces immediately older, heavier or thinner, marked by time, but still fundamentally recognizable. Master Chief Adrian Coles spotted me first. He was 70 now, fully gray, but his posture was still impeccable. He'd retired as the Master Chief Petty Officer of a major command and had spent his retirement running a nonprofit that helped veterans transition to civilian life. Admiral Ellis. He shook my hand firmly. Good to see you, ma'am. Master Chief. You can call me Lauren now. Yes, ma'am. He smiled slightly. Old habits. We talked for 20 minutes, catching up on families, health, work. His wife had died 3 years earlier. He'd found purpose in the nonprofit. His grandchildren were doing well. It was the kind of conversation that felt both meaningful and limited, genuine connection constrained by the fact that we'd moved into different lives. I drifted through the crowd, repeating similar conversations with other familiar faces. A former intelligence officer who now taught at a community college. A logistics specialist who'd become a high school principal. A pilot who'd transitioned to commercial aviation and was counting down to mandatory retirement at 65. Everyone was older. Everyone had moved on. And everyone carried the particular mixture of pride and weariness that comes from having served in something larger than yourself and then having to figure out what comes next. I'd been there for almost an hour when I saw Mason. He was standing near the bar, talking with 2 other men I didn't recognize. He'd aged more than I expected, not dramatically, but noticeably. His hair was completely gray, thinner on top. He'd gained weight, particularly around his midsection. He wore khakis and a golf shirt, and his posture suggested someone who no longer thought about military bearing. He saw me at approximately the same moment. Our eyes met across the room. He said something to the men he was with, then started walking toward me. I didn't move. I just waited, curious about what he'd say after 25 years. Lauren. He stopped a respectful distance away, not presuming familiarity. It's good to see you. Mason. You look well. Congratulations on the Admiral stars. That's impressive. Thank you. An awkward pause settled between us. He seemed to be calculating what to say next. I gave him nothing to work with, no pleasantries, no questions, just neutral attention. I wasn't sure you'd be here, he said finally. I almost wasn't. Decided at the last minute. I'm glad you came. He hesitated. Would you have time to talk? Maybe tomorrow, before the formal program starts. I considered saying no. The conversation would be uncomfortable, potentially pointless. But I also recognized that I was curious. Not about reconciliation or closure. Those concepts felt irrelevant after this much time, but about what he thought there was left to discuss. Tomorrow morning. The hotel restaurant. 0800. I'll be there. He nodded and walked away, rejoining the group at the bar. I watched him go, noting the way he moved, carefully, as though his body had started betraying him in small ways. I recognized that feeling. Age did that to everyone eventually. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. I talked with more people, exchanged contact information I'd probably never use, and left around 2100 hours. Back in my hotel room, I sat by the window and looked out at the parking lot, processing the encounter. 25 years. An entire generation. And yet the weight of our shared history still existed, diminished but present, like scar tissue that aches in cold weather. I slept poorly that night, though I couldn't identify why. Mason arrived at the restaurant at 0745. I was already there, drinking coffee and reviewing the menu. He spotted me immediately and walked over. You're early. Always have been. I gestured to the chair across from me. Sit. He sat, ordered coffee when the server appeared, and waited until we were alone again before speaking. Thank you for agreeing to this. I didn't respond. I just waited for him to continue. I've thought about reaching out for years, he said. But I never knew what to say. Or if you'd even want to hear from me. Probably not, I said honestly. So what changed? I'm dying. The words hung in the air between us. I kept my expression neutral, but something shifted internally, not sympathy exactly, but a recognition that this conversation had stakes I hadn't anticipated. What's the diagnosis? Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Diagnosed 6 months ago. The doctors gave me a year, maybe 18 months if I'm lucky. I absorbed that information quietly. I'm sorry. Thank you. He took a sip of coffee, his hands steady. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad or to manipulate anything. I just wanted you to understand why I asked to talk. I don't have a lot of time left to say things I should have said a long time ago. You apologized 25 years ago. I accepted it. We don't need to revisit that. I know. But that apology was incomplete. I was still making excuses, still minimizing what I'd done. I've had a lot of time since then to think about it more honestly. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Go ahead then. He took a breath. I used you. For years. I took everything you offered, mentorship, protection, advocacy, and I treated it like it was owed to me. Like your competence existed to compensate for my laziness. And when you finally stopped enabling that, I tried to destroy your reputation rather than accept responsibility. Yes, I said simply. You did. I told myself at the time that I was just playing the game. That deflecting blame was normal, that everyone did it, that you were being too rigid. But that was a lie. I knew what I was doing. I just didn't care because it was easier than changing. I sipped my coffee, letting him continue. After you transferred me, I spent months being angry. Telling anyone who'd listen that you'd ended my career over nothing. Brianna encouraged that narrative. She liked the drama of it. But then she left, and I was alone in that staff position, and I had to actually perform without anyone covering for me. And I realized how much you'd been carrying all those years. That must have been uncomfortable. It was humiliating. Every deadline I missed, every report I half finished, every time a supervisor called me out for inadequate work, I kept thinking about all the times you'd quietly fix those things so they didn't become problems. And I'd never thanked you. I just assumed it was your job to manage my failures. The server returned to take our orders. I ordered oatmeal and fruit. Mason ordered eggs and toast. We waited until she left before continuing. I stabilized eventually, Mason said. Found a rhythm that worked for my actual capabilities rather than the role I thought I deserved. I retired at 20 years as a lieutenant commander, which was probably where I should have been all along. I married a woman named Sarah, moved to Colorado, worked in defense contracting for a while. It was a decent life. Not remarkable, but decent. That's good. It was. But I never forgot what I did to you. And I never forgave myself for it. I set down my coffee cup. Mason, I don't need your self-flagellation. You apologized 25 years ago. I accepted it. We both moved on. What's the point of rehashing it now? The point is that I want you to know that I understand the full scope of what I took from you. Not just the mentorship or the professional support. I took years of your time and energy, and I gave you nothing but problems in return. And then I tried to damage the reputation you'd spent decades building, all because I couldn't handle accountability. That wasn't just unprofessional. It was morally bankrupt. I held his gaze. Do you want me to absolve you? No. I don't think I deserve absolution. I just want you to know that I see it clearly now. All of it. And I'm genuinely sorry. Our food arrived. We ate in silence for a few minutes. The restaurant was filling up with other reunion attendees, but no one approached our table. Something about our body language probably signaled that we weren't open to interruption. Finally, I spoke. I spent a lot of years being angry at you. Then I spent a lot of years not thinking about you at all. Now, sitting here, I'm mostly just tired. Not because of you specifically, just tired in the way you get when you've lived long enough to see how patterns repeat. You weren't the first person to use me, and you weren't the last. You were just the most visible. That doesn't excuse it. No, it doesn't. But it does contextualize it. I pushed my oatmeal around with my spoon. The military taught me a lot of things. It taught me discipline, leadership, strategic thinking. But it also taught me that some people will always take more than they give, and you have to decide whether accommodating that serves the mission or undermines it. You helped me learn that lesson thoroughly. So in a strange way, I should probably thank you. That's generous. It's not generosity. It's just perspective. I looked at him directly. You're dying. I'm getting old. Neither of us has time for anything but honesty. So here's the truth. I don't hate you. I haven't for a long time. I don't think about you much at all. What happened between us shaped part of my career, but it didn't define it. I went on to do meaningful work, to earn promotions based on merit, to build a legacy I'm proud of. Your betrayal was a chapter, not the story. Mason nodded slowly. That's more than I deserve. Probably. But it's also the truth. We finished our breakfast in relative silence. When the check came, Mason reached for it, but I waved him off. I've got it. Lauren, it's fine. Consider it a final settlement of accounts. He smiled slightly at that. Fair enough. We stood and walked out of the restaurant together. In the lobby, he stopped and turned to me. I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that seeing who you became, admiral, respected leader, someone who actually lived up to the standards you set, it made me realize how small my own ambitions were. I wanted rank and recognition. You wanted to serve effectively. Those aren't the same thing. No, I agreed. They're not. He extended his hand. I shook it. Take care of yourself, Mason. You too, Admiral. He walked toward the elevator. I watched him go, this man who'd once been such a significant source of frustration, and who now was just another person dealing with mortality. I felt something, not quite sympathy, not quite indifference. Just a recognition that we'd both traveled long roads from where we'd started, and those roads had led to very different destinations. I spent the rest of the weekend at the reunion, participating in panels, reconnecting with people whose company I genuinely enjoyed, and reflecting on what 25 years of distance had clarified. That evening, there was a formal dinner with speeches from senior officers who'd held command during our era. I sat at a table with Master Chief Cole and several others from my old detachment. The conversation was warm, occasionally funny, marked by the easy familiarity of people who'd trusted each other under pressure. Mason was at a table across the room. We didn't interact again. I saw him talking with others, laughing occasionally, looking tired but present. At one point, our eyes met across the room. He raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement. I returned the gesture. The next morning, I drove home. 6 hours on familiar highways, processing everything that had happened. Mason's apology, his diagnosis, the strange experience of seeing someone from your past and recognizing how completely both of you had changed. I thought about the person I'd been at 42, driving off that dealership lot in a truck I'd had to prove I deserved. About the anger I'd carried then, righteous and exhausting. About the years that followed, each one adding layers of experience and perspective that gradually transformed anger into understanding, understanding into indifference, indifference into something more complex. Mason had been a problem I'd solved by removing him from my operational space. That solution had worked. The unit had thrived. My career had advanced. His career had stabilized at a lower level. The system had functioned exactly as designed. Competence rewarded, incompetence managed, accountability maintained. But the human dimension was messier than the professional one. Mason hadn't been evil, just weak. He'd taken the path of least resistance, which happened to run through my competence and goodwill. When I'd closed that path, he'd struggled, then adapted, then lived a decent life at a level matching his actual capabilities. And now he was dying, carrying regrets he'd probably carried for years, wanting absolution I couldn't quite give because I didn't think it was mine to offer. By the time I reached home, the sun was setting over the Gulf. I parked the truck, not the same one from 25 years ago, but a newer model I'd purchased 10 years back, and sat for a moment, watching the light change over the water. I thought about legacy. About what remains when you've finished your career and moved into whatever comes after. I'd served honorably, commanded effectively, advanced to flag rank. I had medals and commendations and evaluation reports that documented 33 years of competent service. I had former subordinates who still reached out occasionally to thank me for mentorship or guidance. I had Master Chief Cole's friendship and the respect of peers I admired. But I also had long stretches of solitude, a house with no one in it but me, and the awareness that I'd prioritized service over almost everything else. That had been my choice, made consciously and repeatedly over decades. I didn't regret it. But I also recognized its cost. Mason had made different choices. He'd prioritized comfort over excellence, relationship over performance, appearance over substance. Those choices had limited his career, but had also given him a wife, a life in Colorado, presumably connections and experiences I'd never pursued. Neither path was objectively better. They were just different, with different rewards and different costs. I went inside, made dinner, and sat on my back deck with a glass of wine, watching the last light fade from the sky. My phone buzzed with a text from Master Chief Cole. "Good seeing you this weekend, ma'am. Take care of yourself." I responded, "You too, Master Chief. Give my regards to your grandchildren." Another text came through a few minutes later, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Mason. Thank you for this morning. Take care." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I typed, "You too. Fair winds." I didn't hear from him again. 6 months later, I received notification through the veterans organization that Mason had passed away. The memorial service was in Colorado, too far for me to justify attending. I sent flowers, a simple arrangement with a card that read, "In memory of shared service. Radham L. Ellis, USN, Ret." I sat in my house that evening, thinking about finality. About how lives intersect and diverge, how relationships that once felt central become peripheral, how time transforms everything including our understanding of past conflicts. Mason had been right about one thing. I had gone on to do meaningful work, to earn respect, to build a legacy. But he'd been wrong about it being despite him. It was partly because of him. His betrayal had taught me to recognize exploitation, to set boundaries, to prioritize mission over misplaced loyalty. Those lessons had served me well for decades. I raised a glass of wine toward no one in particular. "Fair winds, Mason. You taught me more than you knew." The house was silent except for the sound of waves in the distance. I sat there for a long time, an old woman in an empty house, carrying memories of a life spent in service to something larger than herself. Some of those memories were triumphant. Some were painful. Most were simply the accumulated experience of decades spent trying to do difficult work well. Mason's death didn't change any of that. It just closed a chapter that had been mostly closed for years already. I finished my wine, washed the glass, and went to bed. Tomorrow, I'd run my usual route, check in with the defense contractor about a consulting project, maybe call one of my former subordinates who'd reached out recently about career advice. Life continued. It always did. Until it didn't. And when my own time came, whether that was next year or in another 25 years, I hoped I'd face it with the same clarity Mason had finally found, an honest accounting of choices made, harm caused, lessons learned. That was all any of us could hope for, really. To see clearly at the end what we'd been too close to see along the way. I slept well that night, better than I had in weeks. And in the morning, I ran my route along the beach, watching the sun rise over familiar water, grateful for another day to do the work of living deliberately. And that's how a single moment over a set of truck keys showed me exactly how far I'd come and how much I'd stopped letting other people define my worth. What about you? Have you ever had someone underestimate you and then choke on their own assumptions? Have you ever walked away stronger after cutting off someone who held you back? Drop your story in the comments. I read all of them. If this resonated, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. I'll see you in the next one.